Hey, what is going on everyone out there? I'm Jakejames Lugo. Welcome to the channel and welcome to the Ultimate Star Wars Games tier list.
Hello there.
If you haven't already, I have to highly encourage you, there'll be links in the description box below to check out the 2 previous videos for every single Star Wars game ranked on both PlayStation and Xbox platforms. I literally went through every single game on every single console and handheld for PlayStation and also for every single Xbox platform. But now, with this one here, we're going to talk about Nintendo. Now, with Nintendo Star Wars games, we have to do things a little bit differently, so things are going to be split up into 2 videos. This video here is going to be for every single Star Wars handheld game. That's every single Star Wars game on every single Nintendo handheld. That includes Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, and Nintendo 3DS. Those are the 5 main Nintendo platforms that are handhelds that have Star Wars games on it. The other thing too, like in the previous video, we're going to establish some rules where it's only real Star Wars games. So no Angry Birds Star Wars, no Star Wars Pinball. Lego Star Wars does count, which gets counted amongst all the other Star Wars games that we're going to actually talk about here.
Impressive. Most impressive.
Because at least I find that these games are legit, specifically real Star Wars games that are focused with Star Wars as the headline franchise or the IP that's like the main pull for this. So there's a lot of games to get through. That's the main reason why we're splitting up the Nintendo stuff. So there's going to be 2 videos about Nintendo Star Wars games, and we're starting off with the handheld stuff. So if you haven't already, before we really get started, make sure you leave a like on this video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Definitely go check out the other 2 videos. Again, they'll be linked in the description box down below, along with timestamps to all the different sections of the platforms that we're going to talk about here. Let's get this bad boy started, because we have to go in order, of course. There are so many different Star Wars games that are radically different than what's on the home consoles, even though there are some games that were ported over, quote-unquote, that have the same name, like Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith, like Super Star Wars Return of the Jedi, like Lethal Alliance, The Force Unleashed, the list goes on. But the majority of these games were very different, and the majority of these games, let's be honest here, were not that good. We're going to have a rough one here with the Nintendo handhelds.
I have a bad feeling about this. I've got a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Let's start off with the Game Boy games. Let's start off officially with the first one here, Star Wars on Game Boy. Now, if you haven't played this, there has been a bunch of different Star Wars games that are just called Star Wars that are literally about Star Wars A New Hope. That's literally the main thing of what they're all about. So if you haven't played any of these, I don't blame you, because some of them are just kind of mediocre. Some of them are just kind of whatever. A lot of people don't talk about them in comparison to other Star Wars games.
What?
But with this one being one of the first ones on the Game Boy about A New Hope, was this a good Star Wars game? I'm going to be honest with you, not really, because this was basically a port of the NES Star Wars game. If you never played Star Wars on NES, it's essentially about A New Hope. It essentially allows you to control Luke Skywalker from the very beginning of the time in the movie that he appears, all the way through to the ending where he blows up the Death Star. But it's done with an action platformer type of way. There's a little bit of variation with some vehicles. Not so much in here as much. It's much more with the action platforming. But still, if you played Star Wars on NES, this is very similar territory. Or at least I should say Star Wars on Famicom, Star Wars on NES. You get the idea. But where does this Game Boy game rank on the tier list? I'm going to say this game is about a C tier.
What?
Just about a C tier. It's not that great, but it's not trash. And you're going to see why when we start getting to some of these other Star Wars games on Nintendo handhelds, because things get very bad. Let me put it that way. Things get very bad.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Very, very, very bad. But this game is meh, but it's a port of an NES game that is not as good as the NES game, but not as like worse than it. It's not terrible. It's not garbage. So we're putting Star Wars on Game Boy at the C tier. Moving on next, logically and naturally, Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back on Game Boy. This is another game that's almost like a port of the NES game brought over to Game Boy, just not as good. The difference with this one is that I feel like the sound and also some of the controls and also just like the visuals with the Game Boy Color, or just the Game Boy I should say, the visuals themselves are a little bit worse than the actual Star Wars on Game Boy. I find that this one, The Empire Strikes Back, suffers a little bit more from all this stuff, especially limited by the technology of the Game Boy in comparison to its predecessor. However, I don't think it's like, again, a garbage tier, but I am going to say that it's about D tier, and I'm putting it in D tier because its visuals, its sound, its controls are a little bit worse than its predecessor. It's not a trash tier game, but not essentially good. It's just, again, if you played Star Wars games on Game Boy, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a lot of limited stuff with the technology of the time. In comparison to the NES, because the NES was still limited, but at least you had the color visuals, you had the better sound stuff, you know, as far as the music and the sound effects. You had better controls, in my opinion, even though they're kind of the same on Game Boy. But still, it feels better to play those games on the NES than it does on the Game Boy. So Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back goes the D tier right after its predecessor on C tier. Star Wars, Super Star Wars, not The Empire Strikes Back. Look at this. I'm all tongue twisted over here. Super Star Wars, Return of the Jedi. This is, again, another port of the Super Nintendo game, I should say, of Super Star Wars, the trilogy that we have on the Super Nintendo. Again, not as good as its console counterpart. The console version of Super Star Wars, radically better. Looks much better because it's not on the Game Boy. It's on the SNES. This one looks way worse. Controls way worse because you have less buttons. This one I'm putting also in D tier. And the main reason being is because I feel like a lot of the better stuff that you get from Super Return of the Jedi on the Super Nintendo is completely just downgraded and diluted on the Game Boy. Some people might like this because it's a port of that game and they really love the Super Star Wars trilogy. But if we're being objective here, if we're being honest, this game still isn't all that great. Now, unfortunately, it works out that the original Star Wars game on Game Boy is better than its sequels, and that is the way it is. Like, there's a lot of, like, all over the place, like, roller coaster riding when it comes to quality for Star Wars games on portable consoles, specifically for Nintendo portable consoles, because there were so many, as you guys can see. However, the quality of them were just all over the place. A lot of them are just not that good, as you're going to see. There's very few that we're going to get into that are actually pretty decent, but we'll talk about those when we get to them.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I believe we do. Do we have any more Game Boy, like specifically Game Boy games? I don't think so. So those are the three main Star Wars games on Game Boy. So now let's go to Game Boy Color. Game Boy Color is another one. Let's start off Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. A lot of people love pod racing, right? A lot of people love pod racing, especially if you play it on the consoles, which is, again, Episode 1 Racer on the Nintendo 64. On the PlayStation, 2, we had Episode 1 Racer Revenge. We also got a port of this game on current consoles right now. But what about on Game Boy? Was it at least any decent or as good as the console counterpart? Absolutely not.
What?
This game was still kind of garbage. You know, not garbage like in trash tier here, but still pretty bad for what it was, as far as being an adaptation of pod racing. If you've ever played any of those Micro Machines racing games, or the Hot Wheels racing games from like the 16-bit era into the 32-bit era, so like, we're talking Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, maybe the PC Engine type of era, maybe on PC itself.
What does that got to do with anything?
That's what Episode 1 Pod Racer is like on the Game Boy, and it's not that good. It is definitely not up here. Let's be real here. It's not even on C tier. It's going right into D tier. Because I think that it doesn't play that good. It sounds terrible on the Game Boy. It's very annoying listening to the pod racers. It just is like, it's like your Game Boy's having an aneurysm. That's literally what it sounds like. It's just terrible. Terrible, terrible adaptation of Episode 1 Racer. Not yet trashed here. We haven't gone to the trash just yet. Okay, trust me, it is happening soon, but this game is not that good. It's meh, it's whatever. If you like pod racing, you might have picked this up back in the day after Episode 1 came out, but not really a great game overall. You know, yeah, I'm tempted to put it in trash tier, but at least it functions better than most other games that we're going to look at trash tier.
I don't believe that. And you're sounding like a separatist.
So more Game Boy Color, okay? Let's go to Yoda Stories, okay? Now, here's our first trash tier game.
What?
When it comes to Star Wars. The reason being is because this is a port of a PC game that was very limited in what it was actually designed to do based on the technology of the time. But imagine all that, how limited that game was, which was Yoda Stories on the PC, on the Windows, I believe it's a Windows 95 PC. I could be wrong. But that game diluted even further. Like, it's just not good. This is a trash tier Star Wars game. Like, in the same way that Masters of Terras Kasi is trash tier to the PlayStation 1, Yoda Stories is trash tier to the Game Boy Color.
It's not true. That's impossible.
Like, it's that bad, son. It's that garbage. It's just, everything about it that you hate about Yoda Stories is made that much more worse on the Game Boy Color. Between the sound, between the controls, between the random nature of Yoda Stories, it is just not a great game. And I'm a little bit more forgiving with Yoda stories on the PC because of the technology at the time. I wouldn't say it's beyond D tier more than anything else, but I'm a lot more harsh on the Game Boy Color because the Game Boy Color adaptation of this game came out much later, and they had time to maybe tweak it up a little bit, and they just didn't do so. They just left it the way it was, and it's limited by what the Game Boy Color could do. So it's like, you know what? Trash tier game. This game is garbage. Don't even bother playing Yoda stories on the Game Boy Color. It's that bad, people. Moving on from there, more Game Boy Color. Okay, I think we got one more left as far as the Game Boy Color is concerned. Obi-Wan Adventures. Okay, Episode 1, Obi-Wan Adventures. Now, a lot of you have probably never heard about this game because many of you probably didn't even hear about the Star Wars Obi-Wan game that was on the Xbox.
Hello there.
The Obi-Wan Kenobi game is a 3D action, action game that has a couple other elements that are somewhat decent, but it's basically, you know, before, during, and right at the end of Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And this game is the same thing, only imagine that with like an isometric, like, you know, action game that's on the Game Boy Color.
I have a bad feeling about this.
How limited that game was. Here's another one that I feel like is D tier. The reason why I'm putting it in D tier and not in trash tier is because you could get through it from like beginning to end, no problem. It's just, it doesn't sound that good. The controls are a little janky, a little bit wonky. As far as action games are concerned, when it comes to Star Wars portable games on Nintendo platforms, this game is not that great compared to what comes later on, because there are other games that have you controlling Obi-Wan Kenobi or a Jedi character that are a little bit better, and as far as design and how good they feel to play in comparison to this. So Obi-Wan's Adventure, not that good. If you're a fan of Obi-Wan Kenobi, you have better options out there than to play this game on Game Boy Color.
You were the chosen one! It was said that you would destroy this Sith, not join them!
Let's move on from there, and I think that's all of the Game Boy Color games, as far as I know. Okay, if I'm looking here at the list here, there doesn't seem to be any more Game Boy Colors, and I think we could jump directly into Game Boy Advance, which is where things start to pick up just a little bit when it comes to the quality of Star Wars games. So Game Boy Advance. Let's start off. Okay, where is it? Let's go with Jedi Power Battles. I'm gonna put this in C tier. Okay, Star Wars Jedi Power Battles on the Game Boy Advance is not as good as its console counterparts. Remember, this game was on the PlayStation 1 and the Dreamcast. Okay, and I have my thoughts about those games, and I think I've even put them in C tier as well when it came to both the PlayStation versions of that game. I will say that this game is not garbage. This game is not terrible.
At last we will have revenge.
But it's not good either. I think that if you had an option to choose between the Game Boy Advance version or the console version, always go with the console version, because it's everything about that game, including the characters. I think actually this version of the game has less characters, if I'm not mistaken, that you could play as. Because you could play as Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, and Mace Windu. By the way, Mace Windu with a blue lightsaber. Remember, this game and those versions of the games came out before Episode 2 gave him the purple lightsaber.
You are on this council, but we do not grant you the rank of master.
But it's basically a top-down or isometric view action game. Has all the same stuff from Jedi Power Battles on the consoles, but just not as good. It's just, again, another mediocre port slash moving over of that game onto the Game Boy Advance. And the Game Boy Advance has a lot of great games. Like, let's be real. Like, Game Boy Advance is a dope platform, but some of the games like this that were licensed, especially for Star Wars, weren't always the best thing. And this is another example of just one that just wasn't that good. So if you like Jedi Power Battles, you might find some enjoyment with this version of the game, but you have the better option of playing it on the console, either PlayStation 1 or on the Dreamcast. Moving on from there, let's go to now more Game Boy Advance. Let's go to... I'm trying to pick a good one. Let's go to, Lego Star Wars, okay? Lego Star Wars is another one I'm going to put in C tier, okay? And the reason why I put this in C tier is because I enjoy Lego Star Wars, but I don't enjoy the Game Boy Advance version in comparison to what we got on the consoles. I feel like the portable versions of the Lego Star Wars games were further diluted, even though they were competent games, but they're still nowhere near as good as what they are on the consoles. Like, you can still control them, you can still move around, you could collect, like, the different studs, get a bunch of unlockables. It goes through episodes 1 through 3, that's totally fine. But as far as how good they feel to play, Lego Star Wars on the Game Boy Advance, not that great. But again, it's not trash tier, okay? It's not the garbage some people are looking for. Speaking of garbage, though,
I've got a bad feeling about this.
I've got a bad feeling about this, sir.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Oh, I have a bad feeling about this.
this isn't... Actually, no. This is the other one. No, this is a D tier game, okay? This is a D tier game because we're going to get to the trash one next. Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, it's trash. It's, like, bad. but it's not like, you know, completely trash.
What?
The reason being is because it plays very similar, from my understanding, to what we got with another later game we're going to talk about in just a bit. It's very similar as far as like being a brawler / action game that follows most of the stuff going on with episode 2 with Attack of the Clones. And unfortunately, it's not that great. It's actually kind of mediocre. It's kind of whatever. It's meh. And you know, for some people, that's fine. For others, it's like, it's not that good. You know, there are better options to play Star Wars games, especially ones based on Attack of the Clones on other platforms. No, don't even bother wasting your time with this if you have an opportunity to go play, like, you know, the Clone Wars on home consoles, which I still think is bad, but better than this one. But speaking of the trash,
I've got a bad feeling about this.
New Droid Army, man. New Droid Army is in the trash tier. This game is garbage, son. This game is absolute garbage. So New Droid Army is the one I'm talking about. New Droid Army is trash because very difficult to control, doesn't look that great, doesn't sound that great. It has like these MIDI versions of the episode 2 themes, like, you know, the love theme from episode 2 of Attack of the Clones, that just doesn't sound that great, and it's on loop, and it's like very annoying. But everything else about it, I'm just double checking the gameplay. Yeah, everything else about it is just like mediocre, not that great, poorly designed. They're better off. You're better off playing the Attack of the Clones game, which is much better as far as being designed as a game than this one here. This is another trash game. Don't even bother with this. I don't even understand why this game, specifically New Droid Army, I look online, it garners a high price for collectors. Like, why are you guys valuing a good game like, a garbage game like this? It's not good. It's trash. What's the matter with you? Like, seriously.
How can you do this? This is outrageous. It's unfair.
We need to wash that down because there's other trash we got to get through here on this list, and some of it gets really terrible, okay? Let's wash that down with another LEGO Star Wars game. LEGO Star Wars 2, the original trilogy, another C-tier game, which is, it plays very similar to the first LEGO Star Wars. That's why I put them in the same tier. But again, not as good as their console counterparts. They're not garbage games. They're competent, but just not as good. You're better off playing this game. Funny enough, you're better off playing this game on the PSP, I think, than the Game Boy Advance or the Nintendo DS, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, because there's a Nintendo DS version. It's better off. You're better off playing that game on, was it the PSP? Because the PSP version is a little bit more closer to what the console, home console version is compared to this one. This one, again, it just feels very like diluted. It's still competent, but not that great. So another game that we could talk about on the Game Boy Advance. Where is it? Star Wars Trilogy: Apprentice of the Force. This is going to be one that goes up to B tier.
Impressive. Most impressive.
Now, surprising, right? A surprise for sure. Trust me. The thing is that this game follows Luke Skywalker from Episode 4, A New Hope, all the way through Return of the Jedi. It controls very similar and is built very similar in premise to the older Star Wars games from, like, you know, Super Star Wars or even Star Wars on the NES. Very similar to those games, but done with like a 2.5D type of style. If you've ever played like Castlevania Mirror of Fate on 3DS, or played like, you know, Mega Man 11, for example. Yeah, is it Mega Man? Yeah, it's Mega Man 11. Very similar to that 2.5D style where it's 2D gameplay, but some of the visuals and the models are 3D-esque, or at least they look 3D. They're built like 3D models. And if you like Luke Skywalker, if you like action games, you know, very similar to Super Star Wars, this is a little bit much more along those lines. It's not as good as those, I will say, but definitely along the same right direction. It's better than all these other games that I've mentioned so far, especially because it covers all 3 original trilogy movies, and it's a lot more competent and better to control in comparison. Again, some of the boss fights in them and the cutscenes, you know, for handhelds are pretty darn good in comparison to everything else. If you've ever played Minority Report, it kind of reminds me a little bit of that as far as the cutscenes and the story presentation, but still, in this list right here, as far as the tier list for portable Star Wars games on Nintendo platforms, it's the better of the bunch right now. That's why I put it in B tier. So if you had to choose one that was good on the Game Boy Advance, this would be it.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
Now let's go all the way back down to trash. Star Wars Flight of the Falcon. My God, man.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Where do I even begin with this game? This game is so terrible. Not only in the visual department, in the gameplay department, in the sound department. This game is horrible. Like, this is an automatic trash tier Star Wars game. Like, my God, what the hell happened with this? Like, we love Han Solo. We love the Millennium Falcon. We love Chewie. We love Star Wars games that takes place in space. Okay, when it comes to, what is it, space combat, starship fighters, or starfighters, or any of that stuff. We love that type of stuff. We could take on Imperial TIE fighters or Star Destroyers. I'm down. I'm ready. I'm here. But this game right here, Flight of the Falcon, it's so bad. I've done a video on this before. It looks terrible. Like, it's hard to make out certain things on the Game Boy Advance screen, let alone if you blow it up on like an emulator or something. It's still difficult to make out what exactly you're looking at. And don't even get me started. Don't even get me started on the missions or the levels where you actually have to control a vehicle and you have to dodge certain obstacles, because it is near impossible to deal with all that. It is so aggravating, so annoying. Looks absolutely like trash, so it must be trash. This is probably one of the worst. Right next to Yoda Story, son. As far as like, if I had to put the rank here, put this right over here next to Yoda Stories. Like, it's really that bad, okay? At least New Droid Army tries to do something. You know what I'm saying? Like, these are 3 trash tier Star Wars games that it's like, a trifecta of garbage, son. Oh my god. I can't even talk about it no more. Let's go back up to one that's actually much better, okay? Now I have to double check the screenshot of it, because again, like, some of these things in here, they just get like so they start to bleed together. So Revenge of the Sith on GBA is an A tier Star Wars game.
What?
Just to wipe out that nonsense. This one's a little bit better than Apprentice of the Force. And the main reason being is because Revenge of the Sith is actually a brawler. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Final Fight, Streets of Rage. Built in the same spirit as the console counterpart, which, again, had 3D visuals. It was a brawler, an action game, co-op that you could play. This one, very similar, only it's done like a brawler. 2D side-scrolling brawler, which actually controls a lot better than what you might actually think. And it goes through all of Revenge of the Sith. All the story beats that you could think of. It has a couple little tidbits here and there, and also a couple RPG elements as far as like powering up your character, because you get to play as Obi-Wan.
Hello there.
You get to play as Anakin, which is dope. As far as portable Star Wars games are concerned, this one here is the best of the bunch, in my personal opinion, as far as which ones are good and which ones are bad. If you've never played this one before, but you love Revenge of the Sith, try it out for yourself, and you'll see exactly where I'm coming from. The visuals are very different, but the controls, and as far as like the way that the game is built and designed, I think are pretty darn good. That's the best portable Star Wars game to date, in my personal opinion. So let me know if you agree or disagree with that, because, again, a lot of people feel very strongly about Revenge of the Sith, let alone about Star Wars games, but this is the one that I feel like is the best one thus far.
Another happy landing.
Now, as far as GBA games are concerned, I think we got through all of them, right? Yeah, I think we got through all of them. So far, look at this list, man. We got Revenge of the Sith on top at A tier, which some people will put in S tier. I don't think so, because of certain design choices with it. I don't think it's S tier. Then we got, what is it? Trilogy, Apprentice of the Force, in B tier, and then we start to get really populated in the C and D tier with all these mediocre kind of like meh Star Wars games. C tier, I shouldn't even say that. C tier is like, okay, it's competent, but then D tier is when it starts to get real bad, and then the trash tier, the 3 worst Star Wars games on Nintendo handhelds. Like, I don't think there's even a question amongst people about how bad these games are. Like, these games are terrible. Especially Flight of the Falcon. Like, I'm looking at you, Flight of the Falcon. It's just, it's garbage, son. Terrible. Terrible, son. Anyway, let's move on to the Nintendo DS, which is right after GBA. A lot of people would say, like, oh, what about Game Boy Micro and stuff? Like, Game Boy Micro is pretty much the exact same thing as Game Boy Advance. Technically, Game Boy Color and Game Boy have pretty much the same platforms, but some games couldn't be played on a Game Boy, but they had, like, the color stuff with it. It's whatever. We're moving on to Nintendo DS. That's the next one on the list. Let's go with The Force Unleashed. And The Force Unleashed, okay, I'm going to put this one in D tier, because The Force Unleashed 1, okay, The Force Unleashed 1 on DS, not as good as any of the other versions that The Force Unleashed has. Not as good as the home console versions on Xbox 360 or PS3, hands down, or PS2 version. Not as good as the PSP version, because I have the PSP version on me here. I got it not too long ago. What is this? Part of my collection. And yeah, it's like a super watered down version of the PSP version or the PS2 version, but just further watered down. Just like there's a lot of like visual things that just don't look good. It still has the 3D roaming a little bit in comparison to like other versions of the game. but still just not as well done. It's just kind of whatever. This is a game, like, I feel like if you skip this version of The Force Unleashed, you're not going to be missing anything. Like, you have the PS3 360 version, you have the Wii version, you even have the new Nintendo Switch version, which is the Wii version, just ported over. You have the PSP version, the PS2 version. There's a lot more options to play The Force Unleashed that are far better than this one.
Bad feeling about this!
But speaking of The Force Unleashed, automatic trashed here. Force Unleashed 2. My God, what happened to this version? Like, we went from, like, the 3D visuals or 3D movement to, like, a 2D, like, watered-down version of a game that was pretty mediocre and pretty bad, but then even further just, like, made worse. The sound sucks. The controls suck. The visuals of everything else about it, as far as pulled from other versions of The Force Unleashed 2, absolutely are garbage. Again, this version I felt like didn't need to exist. Like, if you're not going to make it similar to what the home console versions were, you don't need this game. And I could even say the same thing about the first Force Unleashed game, because I love Starkiller. I'm down to play the Force Unleashed, but not these versions. Not these versions at all. And definitely not the Force Unleashed 2. That version should have been canceled. It's just, like, not that good. It's trash. It's garbage. Like, what are you doing?
It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them!
Revenge of the Sith DS. Again, I have to just make sure I'm talking about the right one. The DS version is very similar to the GBA version, but I'm going to put this one in B tier, okay? And the main reason why I'm going to put it in B tier is because you don't really get much out of the second screen. It's almost the exact same type of game, but, like, you get, like, what, the extra button presses to do special moves or to show your actual skills and stuff, and there's not much different. Like, you could say, like, technically the DS version is better than the GBA, but I prefer the GBA. If I had to really choose personally for, like, a brawler, for something that had those style of visuals, I feel like that's the version to go with. Some people will say the DS, but not for me, to be honest with you. I think it's fine. It's like you're not getting much out of it. Like, it's not bad. It's not garbage. Definitely not garbage. But it's not, like, anything more beyond that. So if I had to choose which one was the better one, I would still say the GBA. But that's a personal preference from mine. Some people would say, like, well, this one's on later hardware. This one has more stuff, probably, more than likely. It's like, okay, if you want to think like that, that's fine. But as far as this tier list is concerned, definitely go with the GBA version rather than the DS version. But I digress, though.
I don't believe that. And you're sounding like a separatist.
Let's go on to the next game. Lego Star Wars 2. I'm going to put this one in kind of, what is it, in, where did I put this one? Because this one's a little bit more competent than the GBA version. You know what? No, we're going to keep it in C tier. I think that's fair to keep it in C tier. Because, again, not that much different from the GBA. It does control a little bit more closer to the home console version. But again, if I had a preference of every version, which one I would go with of Lego Star Wars 2, the original saga, or the original trilogy, I would go with the console version and then the PSP version. I feel those versions are just much better designed, that they're much more closer together than what you get here with Nintendo. So I digress, though. Some people might feel differently, but I feel like those versions are better than what we got on the Nintendo DS. Speaking of which, there's also going to see a couple of repetition in here. This one also, Complete Saga. Now, this one gets bumped up to B tier, but I still think you should go play the console versions of this game as opposed to the Nintendo DS version. The only reason why this is getting over the other two Lego Star Wars games is because this is the Complete Saga. It's all 6 films. So there's more content, more places to go, more things to see. That's fine, okay? But again, just on the tier list here, that's the only reason why I'm putting it above the other two previous Lego Star Wars games, because it's the Complete Saga. If you had a choice, though, go play this on home consoles. It's just so much better. There's so much more content, so much more better visuals, music, etc. But again, that's just my opinion.
Impressive. Most impressive.
Now, as far as DS games, let's talk about these Clone Wars games, okay? First one's first. This one's going directly in D tier. Star Wars The Clone Wars Jedi Alliance. I played this game for a bit and then I just stopped playing because I felt like I wasn't getting much out of it. The Clone Wars games, which, funny enough, this game was the only version that I saw. I didn't remember seeing Jedi Alliance on the consoles, which is weird because Clone Wars Republic Heroes got a console version, but this one didn't. It's like, this feels like it's made like in the same vein as Republic Heroes. So I found that a little bit confusing. But again, these two games, Clone Wars Jedi Alliance and Clone Wars Republic Heroes, are very similar in nature. So they both get D tier. I'm just putting them both in D tier, to be honest with you, because they control worse than the Republic Heroes console game version, I should say. They're based on the Clone Wars, which is totally fine, the animated show, but their controls are not that great. You have this thing with the stylus, with the lightsaber combat, which I don't like. This was a habit with the Nintendo DS, where they really tried to get players to use the stylus whenever you're going to slash something or do certain motions and stuff, but they overused it. And I feel like these games do something similar. You know, I think that Republic Heroes doesn't do it as much as like Jedi Alliance, but still, like, I would rather have none of that whatsoever and just let me control my characters with the actual D-pad and the control face buttons. But still, these games, you're not getting much out of them. You're not really seeing much that isn't already seen in better versions or other games that do the Clone Wars, in my opinion, a little bit better. The console version of Republic Heroes, I think, is better than both of these. Like, if you had to choose a Clone Wars animated game that you wanted to play, go play that game on the PlayStation 3 if you wanted to. I feel like that's just a much better option than anything else.
I've got a bad feeling about this, sir.
Okay, so we got a couple more DS games. Now, Lego Star Wars 3, this is Lego Star Wars 3. This is the DS for. This is the 3DS version. Okay, I think this. Okay, this is the DS version. This one's also going to get C tier, much like the other Lego Star Wars games. Same idea. It's focused on the Clone Wars, but the console version is much better. The sound is much better as far as, you know, between all the different versions. It's not a bad game. It's not a trash game. It's competent, but just not as good as some of the other options. And I don't think it's better than the Complete Saga, if I'm going to be honest with you, on the DS. I think the DS version of the Complete Saga is better than all these here, but instead of all these, go play the console versions of any one of these games and you have a better option. The same thing could also be said for The Force Awakens. Oh wait, no, this is 3DS. Whoops. Is this also 3DS? Yeah, this is the 3DS. Okay, this is the 3DS version. No. So, instead of that, let's go to another trash tier Star Wars game. Because, my God, man, what happened here?
What?
Star Wars Battlefront Elite Squadron. This is the only Star Wars Battlefront game that I could legit say is absolute trash and you should never play. The reason being is because the PSP version plays much more competently, or at least competently in the same way that whatever Star Wars Battlefront 3 was going to be, the PSP version of Elite Squadron is a little bit more true to that spirit of what that game was going to be compared to this one. This one, they turn it into like a top-down or isometric view like action game or shooting game that isn't even really a shooter. It's like, what happened here? Like, what were you thinking? Like, if you're not going to make Battlefront like Battlefront, don't even bother. It's like, I looked at this, I played it for a bit, I'm like, I just can't right now.
It's not true. That's impossible.
Okay, this is almost as bad as the other trash tier Star Wars games on Nintendo platforms. It's like, come on, man. What the hell? Like, seriously. Anybody who has played this version of the game will tell you it is not like Battlefront anywhere else. There are so many more better options to play a Battlefront game than this garbage right here. You are absolutely, totally avoid this. This is absolute garbage, okay? Do not play Elite Squadron on the DS. It's horrible. The final one I'm going to put in C tier is going to be Lethal Alliance. Lethal Alliance is the last DS game that we have on our list here. And Lethal Alliance, I think, is better on the PSP. This version of the game has lesser quality visuals, but also I think that the sound might be a little bit messed up. Personally, from what I heard when I was playing it, I think the PSP version has better sound. It has better, just again, the controls feel a little bit better in my personal opinion. I don't think you're getting much out of the dual screen. Like, as far as like the second screen, you're not really doing much with it. But also, if we wanted a much more competent version of this game, which I really do wish that they ported Lethal Alliance over to home consoles, or at least we got a home console version of that. If you had to choose between all of them, just go with the PSP version. I just think that you're going to get better visual fidelity, you're going to get better sound quality, better feeling controls, and it's the lesser of two evils more than anything else. I think I put Lethal Alliance in C tier in my previous list for PlayStation games, but still, like, if I had to choose, that version of the game is much better than this one. It just feels like Nintendo platforms just got the shorter end of the stick as far as quality when it comes to a lot of these games that are on multiple platforms. So this is another example of that. I mean, look how many trash tier games we got. Like, in comparison to everything we've done so far, it's like, oh my God, it's so frustrating.
How can you do this? This is outrageous. It's unfair.
So finally, that's all the Nintendo DS games. Okay, we've done all the Nintendo DS games. Look at this list, man. Like, Nintendo, what was going on with you from like the mid 90s to like the early 2000s or 2010s? Like, what was happening, son? Like, this is all over the place. There's like no S-tier Star Wars games on handhelds for Nintendo. That's shocking, son. Absolutely shocking. But for the 3DS, we don't have many to choose from again. And the main reason why we don't have a lot to choose from here is because we're not doing Angry Birds Star Wars and we're not doing Star Wars Pinball. I'm not counting those as part of the Ultimate tier list because I find that those aren't true Star Wars games. Okay, so we have 2 Lego Star Wars games, which we got to settle with here. We got Lego Star Wars The Force Awakens, which is C tier. Same thing that I've said already for all the other Lego Star Wars games. And I'm going to put Lego Star Wars 3 also in C tier. Same exact idea when it comes to the DS. These are all like, again, not that special. If you could argue, you could totally argue that Lego Star Wars 3 and Force Awakens should be in B tier. But for me personally, I still find them to be in C tier because they're just not as good as their console counterparts. They just don't have the visual quality in comparison, the sound quality, the controls, the amount of content. These games are just better to play on the Xbox 360 or Xbox Series X or Xbox One and the PlayStation consoles. It's just a fact. Those games are just much more better overall. These are like watered down ports of those games, and it really shows. Look at this list, man. Ugh. Dude, Nintendo, I'm disappointed. Like, this right here is the ultimate Star Wars tier list for Star Wars games on Nintendo handheld consoles. And what a disappointment. In S tier, we have zilch, nada, nothing, zero. Zero S tier Star Wars games. That is unheard of, man. Unheard of. For shame. For shame on Nintendo handhelds. We got no S tier games. In A tier, we have Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith on Game Boy Advance. Like I said, I think this game is competent. It's pretty darn good. It feels good to play through. Not as good as the Revenge of the Sith 3D game that's on PlayStation 2 or on Xbox, the original Xbox, but still pretty darn good when it comes to Nintendo handheld platforms. The only one I could really say that's actually good.
Another happy landing.
Moving on to B tier, we have Star Wars Trilogy, Apprentice of the Force, Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith, and Lego Star Wars The Complete Saga. These games are pretty good for what they are. Not the best. Definitely not better than Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith. Again, I still prefer the Game Boy Advance version over the DS version, but they're still pretty competent. I feel like you could have fun with these games. You could enjoy something about them, no matter what type of fan of Star Wars you are. Even if you're an original trilogy or a prequel fan, there's something there for you on all 3 of these games.
You are a bold one.
Now, moving on to C tier. Oh my god, this is when it starts to get bad, people. Look how many games we got in C tier that are like mediocre. We got Star Wars on the Game Boy, Star Wars Episode 1 Jedi Power Battles on the Game Boy Advance, Lego Star Wars, the video game on the Game Boy Advance, Lego Star Wars 2, the original trilogy on Game Boy Advance, as well as also on the Nintendo DS, Lego Star Wars 3 on the Clone Wars on the Nintendo DS, as well as also Nintendo 3DS, Star Wars Lethal Alliance on the Nintendo DS, and Lego Star Wars The Force Awakens on Nintendo 3DS. All these games are mid, they're mediocre. You can find some enjoyment with them, but they just have a bunch of different issues that I have that makes them feel like they're not as good as the previous games that I mentioned higher up on the tier list. They just don't really do enough to really like warrant them to be must-owns, in my personal opinion.
I've got a bad feeling about this.
Now we start to get real bad. Oh my god. Again, I'm looking at this, I'm like, the sheer level of disappointment right now, okay? D tier on this ultimate tier list for Star Wars games on Nintendo handhelds. We have Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back on Game Boy, Super Star Wars Return of the Jedi on Game Boy, Star Wars Episode 1 Racer on Game Boy Color, Star Wars Episode 1 Obi-Wan's Adventures on the Game Boy Color, Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones on Game Boy Advance, Star Wars The Force Unleashed on Nintendo DS, Star Wars The Clone Wars Jedi Alliance on DS, as well as also Star Wars The Clone Wars Republic Heroes on Nintendo DS. All these games have a bunch of problems. They're not that great. You can still play them from start to finish. They're competent enough to be games that you could actually get through more than likely, but they're not that good. If anything, there are better options even on this tier list that it will be a better time spent playing those games as opposed to any of these. And it breaks my heart because I like The Empire Strikes Back. I like Super Star Wars Return of the Jedi. Hell, I'm even down for Episode 1 Racer. You know, even though I don't think that game is all that great on the consoles even. I mean, it disappoints me to see The Force Unleashed on here. Even the Clone Wars are disappointing. It's like, what are you guys doing? Like, what happened within this era of Star Wars games? It's just a damn shame.
It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them!
And now, finally, the creme de la creme of the nonsense and the trash and the garbage. Trash tier Star Wars games. We have Star Wars Yoda Stories on the Game Boy Color. Ugh, it's horrible. Star Wars Flight of the Falcon on the Game Boy Advance. I think that game is I still get mad about that game and how bad it is. Star Wars The New Droid Army on the Game Boy Advance. Another one that's just like, what happened to you, Anakin Skywalker? What are you doing? Like, Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2 on Nintendo DS. This game should have been canceled. Should have never seen the light of day. And then finally, Star Wars Battlefront Elite Squadron, another game that should have been canceled because it's like trash, it's garbage. Every single one of these games, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games, are absolute garbage. They're horrible. They're the worst of the worst on Nintendo handhelds, and it's such a damn shame to see that happen. So there you guys go. That's my ultimate tier list for Star Wars games on Nintendo handheld platforms. Let me know your thoughts about the entirety of the tier list in the comment section down below. Do you agree with the placements of these games? Do you disagree with me? Which one of these games, especially in the ones that are like mid, are some of your favorite Star Wars handheld games on the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, DS, 3DS? Talk to me about this stuff. Did you play Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith on Game Boy Advance? Did you enjoy that game? Did you enjoy any of these trash tier games, which I can't even... If you enjoyed any of these games, like, shame on you, because they're bad. Like, I shouldn't say that, but still, like, these games are horrible, man. Such a darn shame, but that's going to do it for this tier list for Nintendo handheld platforms. Now, of course, I am definitely going to do the Nintendo home consoles, which is going to include NES, Super NES, GameCube, Nintendo 64, or Nintendo 64, GameCube, Wii, Wii U, as well as also Nintendo Switch. So that's about 6 platforms we're going to do for that list, which is going to be much bigger, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll have many more S-tier Star Wars games, which I'm pretty sure will, than what we got here, because Nintendo needs to make up for something. Like, they look at this. Look at this. This is disappointing. The Force is not strong with this list. It's strong with the placements, but like, look at the quality of Star Wars games we got. Like, oh my goodness. Nintendo was messing up back then. I'm just saying. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will talk to all of you again very soon.